President Donald Trump and First Lady Melania Trump's youngest son, Barron Trump, despite growing up in political limelight, mostly stayed out of the public glare. His towering size and reclusive manner are well known. Barron has led a somewhat secluded life, unlike his elder brothers, who only sometimes attend essential functions. He's close to his mother, Melania, and speaks Slovenian and English well. His upbringing in a well-known family has stoked rumors about his possible career path in politics or business, even if nothing is known about his future goals. The public is still interested in what role he may decide to play as he gets older. Birth and education. On March 20th, 2006, Donald Trump and Melania Trump welcomed Barron William Trump into the world in New York City. Barron, the youngest of Donald Trump's 5 children and Melania's only child, was raised in the opulent Trump Tower in Manhattan. Barron received his early schooling at the esteemed private Columbia Grammar and Preparatory School in New York. Barron became the first presidential son to stay in the White House since John F. Kennedy Jr. in 2017, when he and Melania relocated there after his father was elected the 45th President of the United States. He enrolled in St. Andrew's Episcopal School in Maryland when he was in Washington. Barron resumed his education at Oxbridge Academy, a private school in Palm Beach, Florida, close to the family's home at Mar-a-Lago after the conclusion of Trump's first presidency. Children's education and humanitarian aid. Anticipation permeated the grand ballroom of the charity event in New York. The occasion was meant to be a night of grace and friendship, and under the glistening chandeliers, media elites, philanthropists, and high society members gathered to drink champagne and discuss the newest news stories. The guest of honor was Melania Trump, who looked magnificent in a dark blue gown. Despite the political clamor around her husband, she maintained her composure by concentrating on her humanitarian endeavors and avoiding the spotlight. It was the same tonight. The audience became quiet as she took the platform to speak about humanitarian help and children's education. Her Slovenian accent gave her sentences a touch of refinement as she talked with calm assurance. Not a standard Q&A. Mrs. Trump, how does it feel to be complicit in your husband's agenda? Was the scathing tone, intended to provoke rather than ask. Near the front of the crowd stood a tall, well-dressed journalist with a microphone held up like a weapon. His posture was assured, even dramatic, as if he were saying a prepared statement designed to provoke debate and gasps. David Callaway is a reporter notorious for challenging conservatives aggressively while often disguising his animosity as journalistic ethics. There was silence in the room. Like a flame, the query persisted, threatening to ignite something more significant. Some exchanged knowing looks while others moved in their chairs. While some journalists immediately grabbed their notepads and cameras, recognizing a moment worth documenting, others looked to Melania to see how she responded. This would not be your typical Q&A. Everyone in the room understood this was an ambush. There was a faint but noticeable tension instead of the charity's event's customary, courteous mood. Callaway was prepared for a show, and a little smile formed. Was he ready for the answer, though? The accusation. Melania's mouth opened slightly, but Callaway moved forward before she could react. He went on, his voice becoming more confident now that everyone was watching him. Your husband has been accused of dividing the country and fostering hate, he said. His confidence grew as he saw photographers moving toward him and taking pictures of his confrontational moment. The comments weighed thick in the air, and yet you stand here acting like a role model. Don't you think the real role models are those fighting against him? It was oppressively tense. Sensing a potential viral moment, a few reporters grinned. Given that this had significantly deviated from the customary charity event etiquette, a few visitors exchanged uncomfortable looks, uncertain whether to look at Melania or Callaway. Ever calm, Melania stayed still, her face inscrutable, but a glimmer of something, be it humor, rebellion, or just plain patience, went through her eyes. She'd been undervalued and subjected to media scrutiny in innumerable instances, but this was different. It was a moment longer than Callaway probably had expected. Then, before Melania could say anything further, a quiet but undeniably forceful voice came from the audience. Barron Trump making his stand. But a new voice, firm, unwavering, broke the quiet before Melania could say anything. That's enough. Barron Trump walked forward from the crowd, and everyone's attention turned. The whispers were immediately quiet. The calm lad the world had known in the White House was no longer. He was now 18 years old, tall, and had the self-assurance of someone who had grown up in the spotlight. He was the president's person, not simply his son, and he wouldn't allow anyone to treat his mother disrespectfully at that moment. For the first time that evening, his sharp eyes focused on Callaway, who seemed taken aback. Perhaps anticipating a tactful or well-considered response, the journalist had come ready to fight with Melania. But this was shocking. With a calm, dissatisfied tone, Barron questioned, "You call that journalism?" A murmur went through the room. Taking cheap shots at a woman who's here to support charity? You're not looking for answers, you're looking for attention. Others were shocked that the youngest Trump had taken charge of the situation, while others still nodded in agreement. Barron wasn't here to play games, and even those who weren't fans couldn't dispute that. His purpose was to correct the record. Not journalism, but bullying. Callaway shook his head and gave a brief, disbelieving chuckle as if Barron's remarks were only a simple outburst. However, the youthful Trump wasn't done yet. Barron said in an unflinching tone, "You think taking cheap shots at my mother makes you bold?" As a wave of curiosity and appreciation passed through the audience, the murmurs in the throng became louder. It doesn't, it makes you desperate. Even those who thought the Trump brand would be easily dismantled were suddenly paying attention. Callaway straightened his necktie, gathering his thoughts. He sneered, attempted to seem amused. "Oh, come on," he said, with a little smile pulling at the corner of his lips. Barron cocked his head slightly and said, "You're saying a journalist can't ask uncomfortable questions?" He repeated, "Uncomfortable questions?" With a subtle nod toward the audience, he said, "Is that what you call twisting reality for a headline?" A few audience members nodded in agreement as the speaker spoke. "These people came here to talk about charity, about making a difference, but you came here for a spectacle." Callaway was about to respond when he paused for the first time. The room's power dynamic had changed. Just now, Barron Trump reversed the situation. What respect looks like. Callaway adjusted his weight and tightened his hold on the microphone. He'd come into this anticipating a straightforward win, a story that would dominate the news cycle, a moment that would go viral. He was on the defense now, however. Barron moved ahead slowly and deliberately. He said, "Respect isn't about agreeing with someone. It all comes down to listening. Asking questions is more important than leveling charges. However, you came here to get answers, didn't you?" A whisper echoed. "You came here for a moment." A few reporters looked at each other, some uneasy, some curious. Callaway smirked, but it was now forced. "So what, are you saying that I'm incapable of confronting prominent figures?" Barron's face remained unchanged. Difficulty? Yes. However, do you know an ambush? He pointed to the banners behind them that displayed the cause the rally was intended to promote, saying, "That's different. Politics has nothing to do with this. It's about assisting others. However, you've somehow made it about yourself." A few applauded, others nodded in admiration. Callaway started to say something, but Barron wasn't finished. "You want to assault a Trump supporter?" His voice was firm as he spoke. The ballroom exploded as someone said, "Pick on someone your size." Callaway's face became white, and he was speechless for the first time that evening. Expecting a flustered, awkward teenager. The liberal writer who started the altercation, David Callaway, was still attempting to come to terms with what had happened. He had anticipated an uncomfortable, agitated teen, possibly even a hesitancy that he could turn into a viral video. What he hadn't expected was Barron Trump refusing to back down. Callaway's grin faltered for a brief while before he regained his composure. He shook his head in amusement as he laughed. "Respect?" he said in a sarcastic tone. "Forgive me, Barron, but I don't think you or your family get to lecture the press on respect." "You tried to humiliate my mother." A few audience members laughed uncomfortably. Others didn't move. Barron didn't flinch as he saw this unexpected confrontation play out. His voice was steady yet calm when he talked, and his shoulders straightened. "You can ask whatever questions you want," he said. Callaway's grin dimmed a little, but remained firm. "But what you just did, you didn't ask a question, you tried to humiliate my mother." In response, Mrs. Trump is a public figure, he said she should expect tough questions. A simple question. Barron moved closer and Callaway had to glance up at him a little because of his height. "Then why didn't you ask her about her work tonight, about the children she's helping?" The audience erupted. The question was straightforward. but it had a profound impact. Callaway understood that his answer was inaccurate. His purpose was always to minimize Melania to a political pawn, not to draw attention to her achievements. Barron went on before Callaway could get well. You came here with one goal, to make headlines. You didn't care about what this event is actually about. You wanted a viral clip, something to throw on Twitter to get a few thousand likes from people who already agree with you. A silent message. There was a complete silence in the room. A few visitors in the rear exchanged glances, understanding that Barron wasn't only responding, he was in charge of the situation now. Callaway's self-assurance wavered. He looked around the room for support from other journalists, but none of them said anything. They weren't accustomed to being called out this way, not by an 18-year-old or a Trump. Melania stood silently behind her son and touched his arm tenderly. Although she remained mute, her face conveyed power, pride, and the unspoken message, "I'm right here for you." Losing ground fast. Callaway attempted to recover control after seeing that he was rapidly losing distance. He crossed his arms and feigned a sneer, "You're young, Barron." He shook his head. Barron didn't flinch when he said, "You don't understand how this works." He remarked, "I understand exactly how this works with ease." The journalist's sneer completely vanished as he said, "I've been watching people like you attack my family since I was a kid." A routine hit job on a Trump. With a calm voice, Barron stepped forward once again. The audience erupted in whispers as someone said, "I just didn't think you'd be pathetic enough to attack a woman who's done nothing but try to help others." There was a gasp from someone in the back. Some of the journalists were shocked into silence, even though they'd anticipated another standard attack piece on Trump. Callaway's face flushed a little, but he couldn't respond before a different voice from the audience interrupted. This is a charity event. A guy in a fitted suit stepped next to one of the circular tables and said, "Barron's right." A renowned businessman, maybe a benefactor, he was older, had salt and pepper hair, and had the aura of someone used to controlling a room. He gave Callaway his whole attention. "This is a charity event," he said. The crowd echoed more whispers. "This isn't the place for petty political stunts." Others gave nods of agreement. Dismantling Callaway. That night, David Callaway seemed unsure for the first time. He was losing his moment. Barron Trump wasn't done yet either. Tension and anticipation weighed heavily on the ballroom's quiet. Barron had everyone's attention. Nobody had ever seen a Trump attack media like this before, not with rage or deflection, but with icy, controlled accuracy. He wasn't snapping. He was taking Callaway apart, piece by piece. Grew up in a golden tower. The previously self-assured liberal writer, David Callaway, tightened his jaw. He was aware that he was losing control of the story. He'd arrived ready to set Melania Trump up for a humiliating moment, a moment that would make headlines. Instead, he had walked directly into an unanticipated storm. Barron Trump refused to back down, but Callaway wasn't done yet. He shook his head and feigned a laugh as if Barron were a simple, unsophisticated adolescent. "You know, Barron," he said, "it's easy to stand up for your family when you've grown up in a golden tower, but in the real world, people like me must ask tough questions. That's what journalism is." Words sounded defensive. Instinctively, several of the audience's regular suspects nodded. But there was a problem. Tonight, the usual pattern of media assaults wasn't practical. Callaway seemed defensive, even frantic, in what he said. A little grin tugged at the corner of Barron's lips as he cocked his head slightly. He had him. "You mean the real world where my mother's here supporting charities? Well, you're trying to get a headline off humiliating her?" The sneer from Callaway disappeared. Talk about the real world. Barron moved in closer. His voice demanded attention, even if it didn't raise. He pointed to the audience and said, "You want to talk about the real world?" A few attendees raised their hands when asked. Many people here tonight came to hear about helping children, about education and giving back. Others gave a nod. Even those who did not favor Trump had come for the cause, not for a political battle. No longer controlled the moment. Barron faced Callaway once more. The audience moved once more as someone asked, "And how many people here came to hear you make this up about yourself?" There were a few giggles in the room. The dynamic was entirely reversed. The moment was no longer within Callaway's control. He started to reply, but Barron interrupted him. Barron responded, "No, really," while awaiting a response, because as far as I can tell, the only person in this room who thought this was about politics was you. Beat them at their own game. A few gave a clap. It was approbation, not just courteous applause, like a predator assessing the prey. Barron folded his arms and fixed Callaway with his gaze. "You came here hoping to embarrass my mother. Instead, you embarrassed yourself." The audience roared. Even others who weren't Trump supporters acknowledged the change in power. They'd never seen the media be defeated at their own game until Barron did it. He had lost. Now Callaway's face was flushed. He opened his mouth to speak, but the opportunity had already passed him. His self-assurance and cockiness were vanished. Barron leaned in a little and stuck the last blow to put the cherry on top. The ballroom cheered as he remarked, "Maybe try picking on someone your size the next time if you want to attack a Trump." Callaway tensed. He was unable to recover. He'd lost tonight after playing his game. Made his mark. And everyone in the room could see it clearly as Barron turned back to face his mother, poised and calm. Trump's youngest had just left his imprint. Callaway recognized how badly things had gone against him before the clapping died. A rigid, forced face replaced his once confident grin as he was attempting to maintain his calm while the earth collapsed under him. The hunter becomes the hunted. With his shoulders set and his eyes fixed on Callaway, like a lion observing a wounded prey, Barron stood erect. The audience recognized that he'd taken charge of the situation. The hunter was no longer Callaway, the hunted was him. However, the journalist was not yet prepared to concede defeat. With a strained laugh, he straightened his tie. His voice had lost its sharpness, but he tried to seem amused as he said, "So that's it then? You're telling me I can't ask questions because it might upset your family?" Remained smooth and controlled. Barron's face remained unchanged. His speech stayed steady and fluid. He said, "You didn't ask a question." Everyone in the throng murmured in unison, "You made an accusation." Barron was correct, even for those who didn't support Trump. Callaway's mouth clenched. He glanced at some of the other reporters in the room as if he were begging for their support in silence. However, none of them said anything. They were aware of the recent events. Making a difference. Callaway was no longer in charge of the room. Barron moved forward once again, this time with purpose rather than aggression. Just the sight of him caused Callaway to back off half a step. Barron continued, "You attempted to paint my mother as a villain." Barron pointed to the charitable banners behind the stage that featured the faces of the kids and families Melania's organization had helped, saying, "But you failed, because the truth is she's here, helping, making a difference." Body language betrayed him. With a little head turn, Barron said, "And what are you doing?" Callaway's face was becoming redder. "What are you contributing tonight besides negativity?" he said. He'd lost his confidence. His grasp on the microphone tightened. His shoulders strained. His body language betrayed him. And he seemed uneasy for the first time. The crowd no longer supported him. A few of them shook their heads. "Just doing my job." Callaway took a deep breath. He said, "I was just doing my job." Barron grinned a little. The audience roared once again as he replied, "Then maybe you should try doing it better." This time the ovation was deafening rather than just kind. Even those who had entered with doubts about the Trumps were unable to ignore what had just transpired. Callaway had entered to control the space and make the evening a show. The Walk of Shame. Instead, he turned it into the show. And in front of the whole elitist media establishment, Barron Trump had just destroyed him. Melania, who'd been silently observing, gave a little grin. She didn't have to speak. Her son had already expressed everything that needed to be said. Callaway looked away, lowering his microphone as he realized he couldn't rescue himself from this catastrophe. It was the start of the Walk of Shame. He had outclassed him. Barron Trump then stood at his mother's side and turned back toward her. Because he wasn't only protecting her tonight, he was demonstrating that Trump's successor was here to stay. David Callaway's knuckles became white as he held his microphone so firmly. He was defeated. Totally. What's the worst? It has nothing to do with being yelled at. He wasn't silenced for a reason. It was because he was outclassed in front of the room by an 18-year-old. Self-destruct in real time. People were still cheering, murmuring, and gazing at Callaway as if seeing a man's self-destruction in real time. Several of his fellow journalists avoided looking at him, too ashamed to be connected to what had just happened. Callaway wasn't finished yet, however. His career seemed to be flashing before his eyes. This was meant to be a straightforward victory, a story worthy ambush that would quickly go viral. Instead, the individuals he had intended to impress made him seem foolish as he stood there. He had to save this, quick. One final punch. He raised the microphone one more time, forcing a smile. It was weak, but he added, "Well, maybe politics isn't for you if you can't handle a little pushback." It was a last-ditch effort to land a blow. Barron, however, didn't even blink. He didn't recoil or take a step back. He only grinned, a sardonic, wry look that made it obvious. "That's all you have?" At that point, Callaway knew he was done. Barron remained standing there even after he had flung everything. Not touched, written, unfazed. A failure. The ensuing cheering was no longer reserved for Barron alone. It was because Callaway had just been laid to rest. The auditorium echoed with murmurs. Someone laughed. Near the front, a wealthy contributor leaned to his wife and whispered something that made her smile. Callaway caught sight of it. He saw everything, and he realized that he wasn't just leaving this discussion, he was leaving a failure in his wake. Turned around and walking off. His expression tensed. Before turning around and leaving, the walk of shame, he whispered something under his breath that was almost heard above the din. The cameras captured every move. He'd expected to make news when he walked into this ballroom. Instead, he was now one, and it was going to be seen by everyone. Grace and composure. Barron resorted to his mother in the meanwhile. Melania gazed at him, her face momentarily inscrutable. Then, in a bit of motion, she stretched out and straightened his suit jacket with the poise and elegance that had characterized her for years, one that was quite expressive. Barron nodded to her and grinned a little before heading back inside the room. Sensing the occasion, the audience stood up. The youngest Trump. It was an overwhelming standing ovation for Barron, for Melania. In addition, something had altered tonight. People undervalued him for years, considering him a background lad and the youngest Trump. But do you know, after tonight, that error would never be made again. What a time! Barron Trump demonstrated his strength by doing more than simply standing up for his mother. He explained that this was more than merely a dispute by standing in his position and reversing the situation. It was a declaration. However, what do you think? Was Barron doing appropriately in this situation? If you've watched the video till here, that means you've enjoyed the video. Subscribe. Don't forget to turn on the notifications bell icon